God is dead. You have heard this before. But what if Nietzsche was not the first to say it? And what if the original version was far worse? Not a murder, a suicide. In 1876, a German philosopher named Philipp Mainländer published a single book arguing that the universe exists because God chose to destroy himself, and that everything we see is the slow decomposition of a divine corpse. Two threads will haunt what follows. First, can a metaphysics of divine suicide explain why anything exists at all? Why there is something rather than nothing? Second, what becomes of a philosopher who follows his own argument all the way to its conclusion? Not as a thought experiment, but as a way of life and a way of death. Philip Batz was born in 1841 in Offenbach am Main, the son of a prosperous leather merchant. He later took the pen name Mainlander, man from the Main, as if the river were the only inheritance worth claiming. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant and melancholy young man. At 15, he read Schiller and Goethe with the hunger of someone already looking for answers the world had not yet asked him to seek. But the decisive encounter came at 21, when he opened the world as will and representation. Schopenhauer struck him like a revelation and like a wound. Here was a philosopher who had dared to say what others only whispered, that existence is suffering, that desire is a trap, and that the deepest wisdom lies in renunciation. Mainlander devoured every word. He copied passages by hand. He wrote letters to Schopenhauer's publisher. He treated the text not as philosophy, but as scripture. And yet, even in those early years of devotion, something nagged at him. Schopenhauer's system had a gap, and Mainlander could feel it before he could name it. Schopenhauer had declared the will to be eternal, blind, indestructible. The will simply was a cosmic engine grinding without purpose and without end. But if the will is eternal, then suffering is eternal. There is no exit, no final rest. The universe is a prison with no warden and no parole. Mainlander found this intolerable, not because it was too dark. He had no quarrel with darkness, but because it was, paradoxically, too optimistic. Consider how strange that claim sounds. How can a philosophy of universal suffering be too optimistic? Because it preserves something, the indestructibility of being. Schopenhauer, for all his pessimism, could not let go of permanence. The will endures. It can be denied in the individual, but never extinguished in total. Mainlander wanted something more radical. He wanted a philosophy in which even being itself could be overcome, in which non-existence was not merely preferable, but inevitable. He spent the next decade working this out in near solitude. He served in Garibaldi's campaigns in Italy, worked in a bank, lived modestly. All the while, he was writing a single book, one massive systematic argument that would take Schopenhauer's pessimism and push it past the point of no return. In 1876, Die Philosophie der Erlösung, the Philosophy of Redemption, appeared in print. Its central argument is among the most disturbing in the history of Western thought. It begins with a question as old as Leibniz. Why is there something rather than nothing? Every metaphysical system must answer this. Mainlander's answer is unique. God existed, not as a metaphor, not as a regulative idea, not as the ground of being in some diluted Hegelian sense. God existed as a simple transcendent unity. But this God, and here's the turn, did not want to exist. The divine unity, perfect and self-contained, desired one thing above all others, its own annihilation. Why? Because Mainlander argues true peace, absolute rest, is not found in being. It is found only in non-being. And even God was subject to this logic. But there was a problem. God, as a simple unity, could not simply cease to exist. Absolute non-being cannot be reached in a single step from absolute being. And so God chose the only path available. He shattered himself. He broke his unity into multiplicity, and that multiplicity is the universe. Let that claim settle. The rebirth of matter, the emergence of stars and planets and conscious life, all of it, Mainlander says, is the fragmentation of a God in the act of dying. The universe is not a creation. It is a decomposition. Every atom, every force, every living creature is a shard of the divine corpse, moving toward the nothingness that God originally desired. Mainlander writes, God has died, and his death was the life of the world. This is not poetry. It is the foundational axiom of his entire system. Think about what this means for the problem of evil. If the universe is a creation, then suffering demands justification. Every theodicy is an attempt to explain why a good God permits pain. But if the universe is a process of disintegration, there is nothing to justify. Suffering is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Decay is the purpose. And here we arrive at the concept that separates Mainlander from every other pessimist. Where Schopenhauer posited the will to live, Mainlander posits the will to die. Not as a psychological state, not as depression or nihilism in the vulgar sense. The will to die is a cosmological principle, the fundamental tendency of all reality toward non-existence. Every process in nature, he argues, confirms this. Stars burn out, species go extinct, mountains erode, entropy increases. The arrow of time points in one direction, toward dissolution. Modern thermodynamics, emerging in Mainlander's own lifetime, seemed to confirm what he had arrived at through pure metaphysics. The universe is running down. The heat death of the universe, that final state in which no energy gradients remain and nothing can happen, is for Mainlander the fulfillment of God's original will. Does that strike you as monstrous? Or does some part of it, perhaps a part you would rather not examine, recognize something true? Because here's the uncomfortable question Mainlander forces upon us. What if the intuition that being is fundamentally good, the assumption on which nearly all of Western philosophy rests, is simply wrong? What if existence itself is the aberration, and nothingness is the natural state to which everything rightly tends? To understand the radicalism of this inversion, you have to grasp what Schopenhauer actually claimed. The will to live in his system is the thing in itself, the noumenal reality behind all appearance. It is blind, endless striving. It manifests as hunger, as sexual desire, as the relentless biological imperative to persist. Every organism is the will to live made flesh. Schopenhauer's solution to suffering was individual. The ascetic saint, the contemplative artist, the person who achieves the denial of the will to live. But the will itself remains. It is eternal. Even when one individual denies it, the cosmos goes on striving, indifferent. Mainlander saw this as a failure of nerve. If suffering is truly the essence of existence, why preserve the will at all? Why grant eternity to the very thing that causes the problem? His answer: do not preserve it. The will is not eternal. It was God, and God is dead. What remains is not an immortal force, but a force in the process of exhausting itself. This changes everything. In Schopenhauer's world, denial of the will is a personal achievement. In Mainlander's, it is a cosmic process. You do not need to conquer the will. It is already dying. But here a sharp objection arises. If everything tends toward non-being, why does life persist at all? Why do organisms fight so desperately to survive? Mainlander has an answer, and it is characteristically unsettling. The will to live, he says, is real. But it is not what it appears to be. It is a disguise. Every act of self-preservation, every act of reproduction, every desperate clinging to existence, all of it serves the deeper purpose. Life perpetuates itself in order to die more efficiently. Reproduction creates more individuals, and more individuals mean more pathways to dissolution. The proliferation of life is not a triumph over entropy. It is entropy's instrument. Consider the salmon swimming upstream to spawn and die. Consider the spider consumed by her young. Consider the human who labors a lifetime to build something that will not outlast a century. Are these victories of the life force, or are they, as Mainlander insists, evidence that the will to live is merely the servant of the will to die, a mechanism by which being accelerates its own undoing? This is not an argument you can refute with optimism. It sits in the stomach like a stone, and Mainlander knew this. He writes, "The universe is the means to the end of non-being. The movement of the world is a movement from being into non-being, from life into absolute death. What separates this from ordinary nihilism is its strange serenity. Mainlander does not rage against the dying of the light. He sees the dying as the point. And this brings us to the ethical dimension of his thought, where the argument becomes, if possible, even more disturbing. If the fundamental movement of reality is toward non-being, then what constitutes a good life? Mainlander's ethics follow from his metaphysics, with a rigor that most philosophers lack the courage to maintain. The highest ethical act, he argues, is the voluntary reduction of the will to exist, not through violence. Mainlander is explicit about this, but through what he calls the weakening of the will. Celibacy ranks highest. To refrain from reproduction is to refuse to create new suffering beings. It is to close one channel through which the fragmented God bleeds further into existence. Asceticism follows. The reduction of desire, the simplification of life, the gradual withdrawal from the competitive frenzy that the will to live demands. But Mainlander was no mere hermit philosopher. His political vision is surprisingly detailed and in places startlingly modern. He envisioned a constitutional state that would systematically reduce suffering, expand education, and create conditions under which individuals could freely choose the path of renunciation. The ideal state for Mainlander is not one that maximizes happiness. It is one that minimizes the compulsion to exist. It gives its citizens the freedom to let go. Ask yourself whether there is not something deeply honest in this. How many political philosophies promise flourishing and progress, and how many of them deliver? Mainlander promises nothing except clarity. The world is winding down. The only question is whether we do so with awareness or in blind struggle. He also made a claim that might startle readers of Nietzsche. For Mainlander, Christianity understood something essential: the value of self-denial, of suffering willingly borne, of turning away from worldly attachment. But Christianity made a fatal error. It attached renunciation to the promise of an afterlife, a reward. And so the act of letting go became secretly another form of clinging. True redemption requires no afterlife. It requires only the recognition that non-being is not a punishment. It is the destination. There is a Buddhist resonance here, and Mainlander acknowledged it. He read translations of the Pali Canon and saw in Nirvana a confirmation of his own insight. But Buddhism offers liberation within a living practice. Mainlander's system is colder. There is no Sangha, no eightfold path, no compassionate community of seekers. There is only the solitary recognition of what the universe is doing, and the choice to align oneself with that movement or to resist it in futility. Is this philosophy, or is this despair dressed in metaphysical clothing? The question is fair, but Mainlander would have rejected its framing entirely. Despair, he would say, belongs to those who expected something better. He expected nothing, and in expecting nothing, he found a kind of terrible peace. On the 1st of April, 1876, Philipp Mainländer received the first printed copies of the Philosophy of Redemption. He was 34 years old. He stacked the copies beside his desk. He looked at them, the culmination of a decade of thought, the single book into which he had poured everything he understood about existence. The next day, on the 2nd of April, he hanged himself. He was found standing on a pile of his own freshly printed books. There is no way to discuss this without confronting what it means. A philosopher who argued that the universe exists because God willed his own death chose his own death the day his argument became public. Was this madness? Was it consistency? Can we even tell the difference? His sister Minna, who believed in his work, spent years editing and publishing the second and third volumes posthumously. She ensured the system reached its full articulation. But history was not kind. Nietzsche, who had read Mainlander and borrowed from him more than he admitted, dismissed him with contempt. In the gay science, he calls him a sickly, sentimental weakling. This from the man who would collapse into madness 13 years later. But Nietzsche's dismissal stuck. Mainlander became a footnote when he was mentioned at all. And perhaps that forgetting is itself instructive. We remember the philosophers who tell us existence can be affirmed. We forget those who looked at the same evidence and reached the opposite conclusion. You know the names of the affirmers: Nietzsche, Camus, the existentialists who insisted we could revolt against absurdity. But of the thinkers who said, there is nothing to revolt against. The process is already complete. Mainlander asks us to sit with a possibility that Western culture has spent 2 millennia avoiding. That the most honest response to existence is not rebellion, not acceptance, but recognition that it was never meant to last. We began with 2 threads. The first asked whether a metaphysics of divine suicide could explain why anything exists. Mainlander's answer is the most logically consistent cosmic pessimism ever written. The universe exists precisely because something greater chose not to. The second thread asked what becomes of a man who follows his own philosophy to its end. Mainlander did not merely theorize about the will to die. He demonstrated it. We live in an age that celebrates resilience, grit, the refusal to give in. Every self-help book is a hymn to the will to live. Mainlander is the thinker who asks, what if that will is not yours? What if it belongs to a process you did not choose, serving an end you cannot see? His philosophy does not ask you to agree. It asks you to consider the possibility that the ground beneath your feet is not solid, that it is ash, slowly settling. Most will turn away from this. We will choose the philosophers who offer reasons to persist. There is no shame in that choice. The man who stood on his own books to die was the most consistent philosopher who ever lived.